Hello Year 10, this is Miss Gwinnett here and I'm just going to talk you through the poem My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. Now, My Last Duchess is absolutely my favourite poem in the Power and Conflict collection. Robert Browning, actually one of my favourite poets. I think he is absolutely fantastic, and this poem is just such a fantastic creation of this horrible, narcissistic, sinister, terrible human being, the Duke. And I think that makes it a lot of fun to read. So hopefully you will find this video useful. As we've done with other videos in this series, I'll just talk you through the context of the poem a little bit. We'll have a read over of the poem, and then I'll take you through some key annotations. And your theme for this week is corruption. Okay, so as we go through all of this, you should be thinking about what this poem has to say about power and corruption. Okay, I think that should be pretty straightforward with a character like the Duke, obviously a deeply corrupt character who does not use his power for any good or noble aims. So there should be a lot for us to think about there. All right, so a little bit about the context. What are we dealing with here? So this poem was written in 1842. Okay, so Robert Browning is a Victorian poet. However, it's set actually quite a long time before that. So I think sometimes when things are old, we sort of just lump them all in together. But it's important to remember that Browning himself was actually writing about a time period that was several centuries sort of previous to him, even though he himself is writing quite a long time ago for us. So it seems likely that his idea for the poem was based on Alfonso II, the Duke of Ferrara. So Ferrara is just an area in Italy. All right, so the poem is set in Italy, whose first wife died after 3 years of marriage in 1561. But the subject matter of the poem, the marriage market, would have ensured that the poem was topical in 1850s Britain. So the marriage market means the process in which, rich, powerful people would arrange the marriages of their children, or would sort of marry off daughters to strategically rich, important men. So people's marriages, are not being arranged because they love each other or even because they even know each other. It's based on what will bring the most advantage to the families. And obviously, you know all about that because that is also the context of Romeo and Juliet. So that will be very familiar to you. So in the sort of upper classes, that was actually still quite common in Browning's time. So in that sense, the poem was still relevant. Although the sort of character of the Duke, so for a bit more context, a Duke is someone who has been given sort of a title and power over an area of land by the monarchy. And then in most cases, that title, so being, for example, the Duke of Ferrara, will be passed down through all the men in the family for generations and generations and generations. So it's a very sort of, undemocratic kind of power. If someone happens to be in favour, a good friend of, or someone kind of useful to a monarch, the king, then they might make them a duke as a sort of favour and to keep them close and to keep that kind of mutually beneficial relationship going. So it's a kind of power that's completely undemocratic, gives that person a lot of power over that area of land without them necessarily having to do anything to really deserve it. It all just depends on what the monarch wants at the time. So that's the kind of power the Duke of Ferrara has. And that wouldn't have so much been the case anymore by the Victorian era. We still had, dukes and earls and so on, and aristocrats in this country, but they wouldn't have had quite the same level of unchecked power as someone like the Duke of Ferrara would have done in Italy at the time that the poem was set. So something to think about there in terms of the kinds of power that we're seeing in these poems. So who is this poem about? Well, we know it's about this Italian duke, and really importantly, the poem is in the form of a dramatic monologue. Okay, so Browning has sort of made up this character, or he's based him on a sort of historical story that he's heard, and now he is writing the poem as if he is that character. So the poem is not spoken from the point of view of Robert Browning, the Victorian poet. It's spoken from the mouth of this character. And obviously the whole form of a dramatic monologue, as I'm sure you can see, is a sort of quite powerful form of poetry because it's just one character speaking for the whole time. So the Duke is completely in charge of the narrative there. And then just a little reminder of the plot. So what's going on in this poem? the Duke wants to marry a count's daughter. Okay, so he's discussing this with the count's representative, and as he does so, he shows his guests around his palace. And during the conversation and tour, he reveals a portrait of his previous wife, his last Duchess, so the last Duchess of the title. So when we're reading this poem, you've got to imagine these two people. You've got the Duke, and then you've got this representative from the Count, another aristocrat who he's speaking to in a sort of art gallery, but a private gallery that's inside the Duke's palace, where he keeps all of his treasures and his amazing priceless works of art. I remember they are arranging the Duke's next marriage, but for some reason in that conversation he feels the need to go on at length about his previous, now deceased wife, and we will think a little bit about why he does that as we go on. So just to be really clear about who we've got in this poem in terms of characters, we've got the Duke, as we said, who does all of the speaking, so he's always speaking. We've got the Count's representative, who is the person that he's actually speaking to throughout this poem, but we never hear anything from this guy. He's completely silent. He's just there for the Duke to kind of speak at. We've got the character of the Duchess, who exists sort of in the painting and then in the memory of the Duke. We've got Fra Pandolf, who is the name of the painter who painted the painting of his last Duchess. And then we've got Klaus of Innsbruck, who is a sculptor who is mentioned towards the end of the poem. All right, so that's who we are dealing with here. Okay, so before we dig into it in a bit more detail, then I'm just going to read you the poem so you can remember exactly what is going on. Okay, if you have your poetry anthology or if you have a copy of this, you might want to read along as I read it to remind yourself, exactly what's going on. So, My Last Duchess. That's my last Duchess, painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder. Now, Frau Pandolf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Won't you please sit and look at her? I said Frau Pandolf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured countenance, the depth and passion of its earnest glance, but to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I had drawn for you but I, and seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, how such a glance came there. So, not the first are you to turn and ask thus. Sir, 'twas not her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheek. Perhaps Frau Pandolf chanced to say, her mantle laps over my lady's wrist too much, or paint must never hope to reproduce the faint half-flush that dies along her throat. Such stuff was courtesy, she thought, and cause enough for calling up that spot of joy. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She liked whatever she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, 'twas all one, my favour at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries some officious fool broke into the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush, at least. She thanked men. Good, but thanked somehow, I know not how, as if she ranked my gift of a 900-years-old name with anybody's gift. Who'd stoop to blame this sort of trifling? Even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such an one, and say, just this or that in you disgusts me, here you miss or there exceed the mark. And if she let herself be lessoned so, nor plainly set her wits to yours, forsooth, and made excuse, even then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. Oh, sir, she smiled, no doubt, whenever I passed her, but who passed without much the same smile? This grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. There she stands as if alive. Will't please you rise? We'll meet the company below, then. I repeat, the Count, your master's, known munificence is ample warrants that no just pretence of mine for dowry will be disallowed, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. Nay, we'll go down together, sir. Notice Neptune, though taming a seahorse, thought of rarity, Which Klaus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. Right, so there we go. Hopefully that all is ringing a bell. And I mean, I don't know how many of you will do this, but it's a lot of fun to read out loud. So if you fancy just having a nice read out loud of that, perhaps you could perform it to a member of your family. It really does bring the verse alive. I think you really do get the sense of what a kind of creepy, sinister, horrible character the Duke is. All right, so let's now, I've split the poem up into a few sections and we'll just talk about each one in a little bit more detail. So the first section of the poem, I think the most important thing that we learn here and that we need to think about is this symbol of the painting of the Duchess, which has a curtain over it, the bit in the brackets there, since none puts by the curtain I've drawn for you, but I has this curtain over it that only the Duke opens and closes. So this image of the Duchess is completely cut off unless the Duke chooses to reveal it, and then also chooses, you know, to tell this story about his last Duchess. So the Duke has got total control and power over the image of the Duchess, but then he also has complete control and power over the narrative of their marriage. So he gets to tell the story. All right, so all the way through when we're hearing all these criticisms of the Duchess, it's really worth, I think, being quite skeptical about them, bearing in mind that this is the Duke speaking. This is not an objective, fair, even-handed account of their marriage. He gets to control what is said about her. He controls the story. And that, if you're looking for a bit of analysis, language analysis, I would say that the curtain and the painting here, they are a symbol of that control. So if you're looking for, you know, oh, I need a technique to analyze, obviously symbolism is a perfectly valid technique. I would talk about that. So if we're thinking about the corruption of power, the Duke has got complete power over this woman's story, and, you know, he's using that power in a really corrupt way. Something I actually only just occurred to me as I was reading it then to mention as well, I think was also really interesting to think about, is where he says, I said Frau Pandolf by design. By design here means on purpose. He's basically name dropped this artist on purpose. Firstly, to show off a bit. But then really interestingly, to sort of gloss this bit, he kind of says, you know, every time I show someone this picture, they ask me how the painter managed to capture that look on her face. So I will tell you. So obviously what's really interesting is actually this silent representative of the Count, who the Duke is speaking to, actually hasn't said anything. He hasn't asked him the question. The Duke has basically asked himself this question in a slightly clever way that kind of suggests that the person he's talking to has asked him. So, oh, you know, I'll tell you the story, kind of, if I must. But actually the Duke has just asked himself to tell the story. So he obviously is kind of going out of his way to put across this quite damning account of his last Duchess. And as we go on, I think we can think a little bit more about why that is. Okay, so to the next section. So a few things to say here. So generally, this section of the poem is all an explanation from the Duke's point of view, and is a criticism of what he sees as the Duchess's open and quite sort of generous nature. So he feels that she has, as it says in the middle there, a heart too soon made glad. She was sort of, here we go, she was too easily impressed. Now what the Duke means by that really is, of course, that she was too equally impressed by too many things. He feels that the only thing that should sort of impress her and bring her joy is him and the gifts that he bestows upon her. So when she finds pleasure in things like the dropping of the daylight in the west, which is just a nice poetic way of saying the sunset, you know, that really irks him, because why should she be finding so much pleasure in the sunset, which any, you know, peasant can look upon, when she's also got his favour at her breast? And in that case, that will probably mean, you know, a necklace, a gift that he has given her, something that she's wearing literally at her breast, probably some kind of very expensive piece of jewellery. So he finds it really incensing, it makes him really angry that she would value those things sort of similarly. So that's sort of what he is angry about. We also hear get the sort of euphemistic criticisms of the Duchess's behaviour that suggest that this kind of generous nature is going beyond that and into the realm of, you know, flirtation with other men. So again, I think here is a point in the poem where it's really important to remember this idea that the Duke is controlling the Duchess's story. He's using his power over the painting, over her narrative, to speak about her in this way. You know, so when he says things like, you know, her looks went everywhere, that's obviously meant to suggest to us that she's kind of eyeing up other men. So I would say, you know, don't just accept that as fact. Think about the person who's telling us this story. We don't necessarily need to believe that that's true, but he's certainly being very damning about her. And then something else about the sort of the way that he speaks, these little flourishes like this. She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad. He's sort of acting as if, you know, he's making this up as he goes along, like he needed to stop there and think about the best way of putting it. But if you think about it, that's obviously quite fake, isn't it? Because he's said that he's told this story loads of times, because whenever anyone sees the painting, they want to know. So this is actually really well rehearsed, but he's kind of acting as if he's just sort of putting it together now and kind of making it up as he goes along. So again, he's being quite insidious, he's being quite manipulative in the way that he's using his power here. He's obviously trying to kind of get the listener, which is both the person within the poem, but then also us, the reader, on board with him as he sort of justifies himself. All right, and on to the next section. So here we get another really important symbol in the poem, which is the gift of a 900 years old name. So all the Duke's power comes from his title. Okay, so remember that being the Duke of Ferrara, that's not his name, is it? That's not what he gets christened as a child. That is his title, that is his position. And it seems that that's a title that's been in his family for 900 years. So this has been being passed down from father to son for 900 years. And that is a gift that he has shared with the Duchess by marrying her. Obviously, she is then the Duchess of Ferrara. So for him, you know, this is just the ultimate gift of power. So he's so angry that he feels that the Duchess does not appreciate it enough. He feels that she ranks it with anybody's gift. She likes the name, but she doesn't seem to hold it in high enough regard as she does with, so as the Duke kind of thinks that she should. So she's not giving the name enough esteem. And then linked to that is this idea of stooping. Okay, so the Duke has a real problem with her sort of attitude here. But he can't bring himself to actually explain this problem to the Duchess. So he considered it stooping. Remember, stooping is a sort of a physical movement of going lower. So he felt that he would be lowering himself if he had some kind of conversation with the Duchess where he told her that he finds her behaviour unacceptable. It's kind of like, you know, if she can't put that together herself, if she can't naturally work out how she should be behaving, then it's like he's not going to waste his time explaining it to her. So his power, this 900-year-old name, has made him feel so aloof and so kind of above other people that he won't even bring himself to have a conversation with his wife. And we will see in the next section of the poem what he decides to do instead. And finally, again, it's worth noting another little hint at this whole thing that he's doing, where he sort of suggests that he hasn't sort of practiced this speech and he doesn't know exactly what he's going to say, where he says, even had you skill in speech, which I have not, to make your will quite clear to such a one. Now, obviously, that's a ridiculous thing to say because he's here literally making a speech in this poem. So he actually is a skilled speaker. So again, it's very manipulative use of his power that he will try and kind of convince us that that's not the case. So he couldn't possibly speak to the Duchess because he wouldn't have been able to do it because he's not a skilled speaker. Well, of course, he's an exceedingly skilled speaker. So on to the last section of the poem then. So here we kind of find out what happened to the Duchess. So all the way through the poem, obviously, we know that she's dead because it's his last Duchess, because he's arranging, it would seem, a new marriage. But now we kind of find out a little bit more about how that might have come about. And I think this bit of the poem is so fantastically creepy and sinister, the way that he says this. So we get this moment in the line, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. And that's all he says on the subject. But I think I think sometimes I've read criticism of this poem which sort of says, oh, it's not really clear exactly what happened. I don't think that's true. I think this is a very clear euphemism. Remember, euphemism is where you sort of use nicer language to conceal something kind of sort of ugly or shocking. This is a euphemism. He has had the Duchess killed. He's given orders and then she never smiled ever again. I think that's pretty straightforward. So this obviously is probably the most important moment of the Duke's power. And I think that's on a couple of levels. The power that he has over life and death of the Duchess at this moment, but also the power that he has that he would quite happily tell this story to a representative of the Count, whose daughter he is now planning to marry. So he really is completely above any kind of scrutiny. There doesn't need to be any oversight on his power at all. He seems to quite literally be able to get away with murder. And then as we get to the end of the poem, Browning, because he is a genius, just throws in the most fantastic symbol to end the poem. Just a note on this bit in the middle, because I know that some of the language in this is really old-fashioned. All he's saying here is the Count, so whose daughter he's going to marry, his known sort of wealth and generosity is ample warrant that no just pretense of mine for dowry will be disallowed. So if you remember, you might remember from Romeo and Juliet again, a dowry is a sum of money that a man will pay his daughter's suitor to marry her. Obviously in this time, women don't have any independent wealth, they don't have any money of their own. So that would be from the father to the prospective husband, a sort of a monetary sum for marrying the daughter. So the Duke is basically going to get a load of money out of his next marriage as well. And then, as I said, we have this amazing final symbol, which I absolutely adore, of the statue of Neptune. So remember, they're in a sort of art gallery, but it's a private art gallery within the Duke's palace. And as they're going sort of down to meet the rest of the company, they go past the statue, and casually as anything, the Duke goes, have a look at that. Notice Neptune taming a seahorse, thought a rarity. So a rarity, so he's showing off, not only has he got this really rare, precious statue made by this famous sculptor, but the point really is that clearly the Duke identifies himself with Neptune. He sees himself as this god who is taming the world around him with his immense power. And I think it's interesting to think about, in what way did he tame the Duchess? Well, he actually couldn't really tame her while she was alive. Her looks sort of continue to go everywhere, but he has tamed her through death. So now that she is dead, he can control her image and her story both completely. So ultimately, he has actually been successful in taming her, just like Neptune taming the seahorse. Great. Okay, so that's like your little overview of the poem. So to end on, just a thought, because we are talking about corruption of power, it might be useful to think of this poem in terms of answering the question, to what extent is this poem a criticism of the corruption of power? Okay, and I think the answer to this question is pretty straightforwardly, yes, it's a massive criticism of the corruption of power. One of the big things I think to think about, and this really comes through when you're comparing it with something like Ozymandias, is the idea that not only do we see the Duke using his power in this really corrupt way, he's had his wife killed, there is also absolutely no consequences for those actions within the poem. And in fact, even more so than that, he is on the cusp of getting married again and having another Duchess who, assumedly he could do exactly the same thing to. So within the world of the poem, there is no checks on the Duke's power at all. So something like Ozymandias, which is told from the perspective of, he was once powerful, look how kind of the mighty have fallen. That's not the case in My Last Duchess at all. The corruption has completely won out, and the Duke is about to have another new young wife who he will undoubtedly treat very badly. And perhaps, the cycle could continue over and over again, for all we know. So, a really useful poem for comparison about power, especially if you want to make the point that the power of the Duke is sort of not diminished by the end of the poem. It seems to kind of go on forever, especially when you consider that the Duke is a title, as we talked about. It's a 900-year-old name. So even when that particular man dies, the title will live on for a really long time, going from father to son, as we said. So in a sense, it's almost like the power of the Duke never dies, because when one man dies, the son takes over the title. So again, you can see the really obvious parallels with Ozymandias. Okay, right, I hope that was useful. As ever, if you have any specific questions, just message your English teacher. And thanks for listening.